Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into something that might completely change how you think about those relaxing pottery classes at your local community center. We're exploring the ancient art of pottery making, a craft so brutal and backbreaking it would make modern factory work look like a spa day. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. And the first thing you notice isn't the absence of your alarm clock or the strange smell of cooking fires. It's that your hands are completely covered in clay that smells like a combination of rotting vegetation, animal waste, and stagnant pond water. Welcome to the world of ancient pottery making, where that romantic image of Ghost and Patrick Swayze working clay to the tune of Unchained Melody is about to be replaced by something that resembles medieval torture. With artistic pretensions, you're lying on what passes for a bed in a potter's workshop, which is essentially a pile of straw that's been contaminated with clay dust for the past several years. Everything in this workshop is covered in a fine layer of dried clay particles that get into your lungs, your food, your clothes, and your dreams. The air tastes like dirt, and every surface feels gritty to the touch. This isn't the clean, well-lit pottery studio you might have imagined. This is an industrial operation powered by human suffering and desperate economic necessity. The workshop around you is a monument to pre-industrial misery. Clay is everywhere, not neatly packaged in convenient blocks, but in various stages of preparation that look like crime scenes from a mud wrestling tournament. There are pits in the floor filled with clay that's been soaking for weeks, developing the consistency of chunky soup and the aroma of decomposition. The walls are stained with clay slurry that's been splashed, thrown, and smeared during countless hours of desperate work. Your first lesson in ancient pottery begins before you've even stood up clay preparation. That smooth, the pliable material you see in modern pottery classes doesn't exist in nature. It's the product of a process so labor-intensive and physically demanding that it would violate multiple OSHA regulations if OSHA had existed 3,000 years ago. The clay you're surrounded by has been dug from riverbanks by hand, carried in baskets that weigh more than you do, and processed through techniques that make modern manufacturing look effortless. The clay mining process alone would break most contemporary people. Ancient potters had to identify suitable clay deposits, which meant understanding geology without any scientific training. They dug clay from banks that were constantly collapsing, often working in water up to their waist while dodging quicksand-like conditions that could trap workers for hours. The good clay was usually found several feet below the surface, requiring the excavation of tons of useless material to reach deposits that might yield only a few hundred pounds of workable clay. Once you've somehow survived the mining process, you get to experience clay processing, which involves techniques that would make a medieval torture enthusiast take notes. The clay must be cleaned of stones, roots, and organic matter that will cause problems later. This cleaning process involves sifting clay through baskets with holes, picking out debris by hand, and repeatedly washing clay until the water runs clear. Each washing requires carrying heavy clay slurry to and from water sources, often over considerable distances. But the real fun begins with clay conditioning, a process that transforms raw clay into workable material through methods that combine chemistry with physical endurance testing. The clay must be mixed with tempering materials to prevent cracking during drying and firing. These tempering materials include crushed shells, chopped straw, and yes, animal dung. You'll be spending your days mixing clay with cow manure using your feet. stomping around in clay pits like you're making the world's least appetizing wine. The stomping process isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. Clay pits become breeding grounds for parasites, bacteria, and fungal infections that ancient medicine couldn't treat. Workers regularly developed skin conditions, respiratory problems, and infections that could disable or kill them. The clay itself contained minerals that could cause chemical burns on skin that was already softened by constant moisture exposure. After the initial mixing, clay must age, a process that requires months of careful attention. Aging clay develops the plasticity necessary for pottery making. But it also develops things that no modern potter wants to think about. Aging clay becomes a fermentation project where bacteria break down organic compounds, creating chemical changes that improve workability while producing odors that would clear a modern building. The clay develops a sour, yeasty smell, combined with hints of decay and barnyard that permeates everything in the workshop. During the aging process, clay must be kept at consistent moisture levels, which means daily attention to each batch. Too much moisture and the clay becomes unusable soup. Too little moisture and the clay becomes hard as stone. This requires constantly monitoring weather conditions, covering and uncovering clay stores, and making adjustments that could mean the difference between successful pottery and economic disaster. You discover that pottery workshops operate on schedules that make modern sweatshops look worker-friendly. Work begins before dawn because daylight is precious and must be used efficiently. There are no weekends, no holidays, no sick days, and certainly no vacation time. Pottery making is seasonal work that depends on weather conditions. But when conditions are right, potters work until they collapse from exhaustion. The workshop hierarchy reveals itself as you observe the other workers. Master potters, those rare individuals who've survived decades in this industry, guard their knowledge like state secrets. They've learned through trial and error which clay works best, how long it should age, what tempering materials to use, and dozens of other details that can make the difference between success and failure. This knowledge is never written down, rarely shared completely, and often dies with the master potter. Apprentices, which is what you've apparently become, occupy the bottom tier of this hierarchy. Your job involves all the physically demanding, dangerous, and unpleasant tasks that master potters no longer want to perform. You'll spend your first years, assuming you survive that long, preparing clay, carrying water, gathering fuel for kilns, and performing maintenance tasks that require strength rather than skill. The apprentice mortality rate is something no one discusses but everyone understands. Between industrial accidents, occupational diseases, and the simple physical demands of the work, many apprentices don't survive to become journeyman potters. Those who do survive often bear permanent injuries from their training period. Missing fingers from tool accidents, respiratory damage from clay dust, and back problems from heavy lifting are considered normal occupational hazards. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of ancient pottery making is the complete absence of immediate gratification that characterizes modern hobby pottery. Every step of the process requires patience measured in weeks or months. Clay must age for months before it's usable. Finished pottery must dry slowly to prevent cracking, a process that can take weeks depending on weather conditions. Firing schedules depend on fuel availability and weather conditions that might not align for months at a time. This means that mistakes made in clay preparation might not become apparent until months later when finished pottery explodes in the kiln. Workers can spend weeks creating pottery that will be destroyed because of clay preparation errors they made the previous season. The psychological toll of this delayed feedback creates a workshop atmosphere of chronic anxiety, where every worker knows that months of labor can be destroyed in minutes. As your first day in the pottery workshop continues, you begin to understand that this isn't a craft in any sense that modern people would recognize. It's not creative self-expression or artistic fulfillment. It's industrial production focused entirely on creating functional objects that people need for food storage, cooking, and basic survival. The pottery produced here isn't art, it's infrastructure, as essential to daily life as plumbing or electricity in the modern world. The economic pressures driving pottery production are relentless and unforgiving. Potters aren't artists exploring creative possibilities. They're manufacturers trying to produce consistent, functional products quickly enough to earn subsistence wages. Every pot must be functional, durable, and produced as efficiently as possible. There's no market for creative experimentation, artistic expression, or innovative design. Customers want containers that hold water, cooking pots that don't crack over fires, and storage vessels that keep food safe from rodents. By the end of your first day, you're covered head to toe in clay that's worked its way into every piece of clothing, every pore of your skin, and probably every organ of your body. Your hands are raw from handling wet clay. Your back aches from bending over clay preparation. And you've developed a cough from breathing clay dust that will probably become permanent if you stay in this profession long enough. Tonight, you'll sleep on that straw bed in a workshop that never really stops producing clay dust, surrounded by the smells of aging clay and drying pottery. You'll dream of clay, wake up with clay under your fingernails, and spend tomorrow doing exactly the same work you did today, with the knowledge that this routine will continue for years before you develop the skills necessary to actually make pottery. Welcome to the ancient world of ceramic production, where pottery making isn't a relaxing hobby or therapeutic activity. It's a dangerous profession that requires more physical stamina than most modern jobs, more patience than most modern people possess, and more acceptance of occupational hazards than any contemporary worker would tolerate. Tomorrow, you'll discover what it actually takes to shape clay into pottery, and why the pottery wheel was considered one of humanity's most challenging technological innovations. Your second day in the pottery workshop begins with a sound that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life: the rhythmic thudding of a pottery wheel being kicked into motion. It's not the gentle hum of an electric wheel that spins at consistent speeds with the flip of a switch. This is the sound of human-powered machinery that requires constant physical input to maintain even basic functionality. The potter's wheel sits in the center of the workshop like a medieval torture device disguised as a tool. It consists of a heavy stone disc mounted on a vertical axle, with a smaller wheel head on top where the clay will be shaped. The entire apparatus weighs several hundred pounds and must be set in motion by kicking a lower flywheel with your foot while simultaneously attempting to center clay on the upper wheel head. It's like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while also performing Olympic-level athletic feats. Master Enkidu, the workshop's senior potter, whose hands look like they've been carved from the same clay he works with, gestures for you to approach the wheel. Today, you learn to throw, he says, using the technical term for shaping pottery on the wheel that has nothing to do with baseball and everything to do with controlled violence against clay. What he doesn't mention is that learning to throw involves failing spectacularly for months while developing repetitive stress injuries that would impress modern physical therapists. The first challenge is getting the wheel spinning at the right speed. Too slow, and the clay won't center properly, creating wobbly, lopsided pottery that collapses during shaping. Too fast, and the centrifugal force flings clay across the workshop like a medieval food fight. The sweet spot requires maintaining consistent kicking rhythm for hours while performing delicate handwork on the spinning clay. It's like trying to perform surgery while riding a bicycle. Enkidu demonstrates the kicking technique with the casual ease of someone who's been doing this for 30 years. His leg moves with mechanical precision, maintaining wheel speed that varies by fractions to accommodate different stages of the pottery making process. What looks effortless is actually the result of muscle memory developed through years of practice that left countless apprentices with permanent leg injuries from improper technique. Your first attempt at kicking the wheel reveals muscles you didn't know existed and makes them all hurt simultaneously. The wheel lurches into motion with all the grace of a drunk ox, speeds up unpredictably, then slows to a stop when your kick rhythm falters. Meanwhile, you're supposed to be centering clay on the wheel head, a process that requires strength, precision, and timing that professional athletes would find challenging. Clay centering is the foundation skill that separates pottery making from clay sculpture. The clay must be perfectly centered on the wheel head before any shaping can begin. And achieving this centering requires applying precise pressure while the wheel spins. Too little pressure and the clay remains off-center, creating wobbling that will destroy any attempt at symmetrical pottery. Too much pressure and the clay deforms or flies off the wheel entirely. The centering process begins with slamming a ball of clay onto the wheel head with enough force to make it stick, but not so much force that it deforms beyond recovery. This requires judging the consistency of clay that varies with temperature, humidity, and preparation methods. Clay that seemed perfect yesterday might be too soft or too hard today. And there's no way to know until you've already committed to trying to center it. Once the clay is roughly positioned on the wheel head, the real torture begins. You must apply steady, even pressure with both hands while the wheel spins, gradually forcing the clay into perfect circular symmetry. This sounds simple until you try to maintain consistent pressure while kicking the wheel, dealing with clay that has its own ideas about where it wants to go, and fighting against centrifugal forces that seem designed to fling clay at your face. Your hands quickly develop a coating of clay slip, the liquid clay mixture that forms when clay particles mix with water from your skin moisture and the clay's natural dampness. This slip makes everything slippery, reducing your grip on the clay just when you need maximum control. Ancient potters didn't have latex gloves or grip-enhancing tools. They worked with bare hands that became permanently stained and roughened from constant clay contact. The physical demands of wheelwork become apparent within minutes. Centering clay requires applying significant pressure, often using your entire body weight to force clay into submission. Your arms, shoulders, and back must maintain steady pressure while your leg continues kicking the wheel and your core muscles keep you balanced over the spinning clay. It's a full-body workout disguised as a craft activity. Enkidu watches your struggles with the detached interest of someone who's seen thousands of apprentices fail at exactly this stage. Clay has memory. He observes as your supposedly centered clay develops a violent wobble. It remembers every mistake in preparation, every uneven pressure, every moment of uncertainty. Clay does not forgive. This isn't philosophical pottery wisdom. It's a warning about the unforgiving nature of a material that will punish every error with visible failure. When clay is improperly centered, the wobbling gets worse as you attempt to shape walls. What starts as a minor irregularity becomes a catastrophic oscillation that grows with each revolution of the wheel. Eventually, the wobbling becomes so severe that the clay walls collapse, destroying hours of work in seconds. There's no fixing a poorly centered pot. You must remove all the clay, prepare it again, and start over from the beginning. Your first successful centering, achieved after dozens of failures, feels like a minor miracle. The clay suddenly stops fighting against your hands and begins moving in perfect circular motion. For a brief moment, you understand why people become obsessed with pottery making. Then you attempt the next step, opening the clay to create the interior space. And everything falls apart again. Opening clay requires inserting your fingers into the center of the spinning clay mass and carefully pulling outward to create the pot's interior cavity. This must be done while maintaining wheel speed, keeping the clay centered, and avoiding the dozen different ways this process can go catastrophically wrong. Too much pressure, and you create a hole that goes completely through the clay bottom. Too little pressure, and you create thick, uneven walls that will crack during drying. The opening process reveals another cruel aspect of pottery, making every step depends on perfect execution of the previous step. Clay that was slightly off-center during the centering process will create problems during opening that become worse during wall raising. Mistakes compound rather than cancel out. And there's no undo function for pottery making. Wall raising. The process of pulling clay upward to create the pot's walls requires techniques that would challenge a surgeon's steady hands. You must squeeze the clay between your fingers while pulling upward, maintaining consistent pressure and speed while the wheel spins. The clay walls must be kept even in thickness, smooth in texture, and perfectly vertical, or they'll collapse from their own weight. Each pull upward creates stress in the clay that accumulates with subsequent pulls. Clay has limited plasticity, meaning it can only be stretched so far before it tears or becomes too thin to support itself. Master potters develop an intuitive understanding of clay's limits, but apprentices regularly push clay beyond its breaking point, resulting in collapsed walls and destroyed pottery. The throwing process produces waste at every stage. Clay that doesn't center properly gets recycled, but it's never quite the same as fresh clay. Clay walls that collapse must be removed and reprocessed. Pottery that cracks during shaping joins the growing pile of failures that represents wasted time, wasted materials, and wasted effort. In a workshop where every pound of clay and every hour of labor has economic value, waste represents direct loss of income. Your hands begin developing the calluses and deformities that mark experienced potters. Constant pressure against spinning clay wears grooves in fingertips, creates permanent stains that never wash out, and causes joint problems from repetitive motions. Ancient potters' hands were so distinctively marked by their profession that they could be identified by their hands alone. The wheel's demands never stop. Maintaining consistent speed requires continuous kicking, even during the most delicate operations. Your leg develops a repetitive stress injury that starts as a mild ache and progresses to constant pain that interferes with sleep. Master potters often develop permanent limps from decades of wheel kicking. But stopping to rest means stopping production and losing income. Enkidu demonstrates advanced throwing techniques that seem to defy physics. His hands move with precise timing that creates perfectly symmetrical pottery in minutes, while your attempts at similar techniques result in clay flying across the workshop. What looks like magic is actually the result of muscle memory developed through years of practice and thousands of failed pots. The workshop's wheel stations reveal the brutal economics of pottery production. Each wheel represents a significant investment in equipment and space. But wheels are only profitable when operated continuously. Potters work long shifts to maximize wheel productivity, often sharing wheels in rotating shifts that continue from dawn to dark. Downtime for maintenance, clay preparation, or rest represents lost income that most pottery operations can't afford. By the end of your second day, you've successfully created one small, lopsided bowl. After destroying approximately 20 pounds of carefully prepared clay, your clothes are completely saturated with clay slip. Your hands are raw from wheelwork, and you've developed a cough from breathing clay particles that were thrown into the air during your various failures. The master potter examines your single successful piece with the enthusiasm of someone evaluating roadkill. Tomorrow, he says, you will learn why making the pot is easier than keeping it. This cryptic statement will prove prophetic as you discover that successfully shaping clay is only the beginning of a process that includes dozens of additional steps, each capable of destroying your work completely. Tonight you'll sleep in clay-saturated clothes, dream about wobbling pottery wheels, and wake up with muscles you didn't know existed, demanding immediate attention. Tomorrow will bring new techniques, new opportunities for failure, and new understanding of why pottery making was considered one of the most challenging crafts in the ancient world. Your third day in the pottery workshop begins with what initially sounds like good news. You're finally going to learn about pottery decoration and glazing, the processes that transform plain clay vessels into finished pottery. What you're about to discover is that decoration and glazing represent entirely new categories of ways that months of work can be destroyed in seconds, while also introducing toxic chemicals and techniques that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever conceived. Master Enkidu leads you to a section of the workshop you haven't seen before, where the air shimmers with toxic fumes and the floor is stained with what looks suspiciously like dried blood but is actually iron oxide pigment mixed with various bodily fluids from workers who've been poisoned by their materials. Now you learn to make pottery beautiful, he says, with the enthusiasm of someone about to demonstrate medieval dentistry techniques. Beauty requires sacrifice. The first sacrifice, you discover, is your skin. Pottery decoration begins with slip application, which involves coating leather-hard pottery with liquid clay mixture that contains minerals, pigments, and other additives that turn human skin into a chemistry experiment. The slip must be applied while the pottery is in exactly the right state of dryness, a window of time that might last only a few hours and cannot be predicted or controlled with ancient technology. Slip preparation involves grinding mineral pigments by hand, using stone tools that produce particles so fine they become airborne and settle in your lungs permanently. Iron oxides for red colors, copper compounds for green, cobalt for blue when it's available, which it almost never is because cobalt deposits are rare and trade routes are unreliable. Each pigment requires different preparation methods, different binding agents, and different application techniques that must be learned through trial and error. The grinding process alone takes hours of repetitive work that destroys your hands while filling the air with toxic dust. You use a stone mortar and pestle, grinding raw minerals into powder fine enough to mix with clay slip. The grinding produces particles so small they pass through any attempt at filtration and coat everything in the workshop with a layer of colorful poison. Ancient potters developed what we now recognize as heavy metal poisoning, respiratory diseases, and skin conditions from constant exposure to these materials. Once the pigments are prepared, they must be mixed with clay slip in ratios that no one really understands, but everyone has strong opinions about. Too much pigment and the slip won't adhere properly to the pottery surface. Too little pigment and the color will be barely visible after firing. The ratios depend on clay type, firing temperature, atmospheric conditions in the kiln, and phases of the moon, according to some potters who've been inhaling metal oxides for too many years. Slip application requires techniques that make pottery throwing look simple by comparison. The slip must be applied while the pottery rotates on a wheel, using brushes made from animal hair that shed constantly and leave bristles embedded in the pottery surface. The slip must be applied in even coats without drips, runs, or brush marks. While working with materials that have the consistency of paint mixed with sand and the adhesion properties of wet soap, your first attempt at slip application results in pottery that looks like it was decorated by someone having a seizure while blindfolded. The slip runs in uneven streaks, pools in low areas, and fails to adhere to high spots. Master Enkidu examines your work with the expression of someone who's just witnessed a crime against pottery. Tomorrow we try again, he says, which you're learning is pottery speak, for your work is completely worthless, but I'm too tired to explain everything you did wrong. But slip application is just the foundation for decoration techniques that become increasingly elaborate and correspondingly more likely to fail. Burnishing involves polishing the dried slip surface with smooth stones until it develops a shine that resembles polished metal. This process requires hours of repetitive rubbing that creates blisters, calluses, and repetitive stress injuries while producing results that can be destroyed by a single misplaced scratch. The burnishing stones must be perfectly smooth and shaped to match the pottery surface contours. Creating these tools involves hours of work, shaping river stones with other stones, creating abrasives from crushed materials, and polishing techniques that produce tools which might last for months before breaking and requiring replacement. A potter's collection of burnishing stones represents years of toolmaking work and cannot be easily replaced. Carving decoration into leather-hard pottery requires techniques that combine the precision of surgery with the confidence of someone who gets no second chances. The clay must be exactly the right consistency for carving. Firm enough to hold crisp lines, but soft enough that carving tools don't tear the clay surface. This consistency lasts for only a few hours and varies with humidity, temperature, and clay composition. Carving tools must be made by hand from whatever materials are available. Bone tools carved from animal bones. Metal tools hammered from scraps when metal is available. Stone tools knapped from suitable rocks when they can be found. Each tool creates different line qualities and must be maintained constantly because clay dulls cutting edges quickly. Most carving work is done with tools that would be considered inadequate for whittling in any modern context. The carving process itself requires steady hands and perfect planning because mistakes cannot be corrected. A slip of the tool can destroy days or weeks of work instantly. The carving must be deep enough to remain visible after firing, but not so deep that it weakens the pottery structure. Complex patterns must be executed freehand because there are no templates, stencils, or measuring devices available to ancient potters. Pattern development reveals another psychological torture aspect of pottery decoration. Geometric patterns must be mathematically precise without mathematical tools. Symmetrical designs must be perfectly balanced without measuring devices. Complex motifs must be executed from memory without reference materials. The mental demands of decoration work are as challenging as the physical demands, requiring spatial reasoning, artistic ability, and mathematical precision that few people naturally possess. But the real nightmare begins with glazing, a process so complex and unpredictable that it makes pottery throwing look like child's play. Glazing involves coating pottery with a glass-forming mixture that melts during firing to create a waterproof, decorative surface. This sounds simple until you realize that ancient potters had no understanding of the chemical processes involved and no reliable methods for controlling the variables that determine glaze success or failure. Glaze preparation begins with materials that are actively trying to kill you. Lead compounds create beautiful, reliable glazes, but cause brain damage, organ failure, and death through chronic poisoning. Copper compounds produce stunning green colors, along with toxic fumes that cause respiratory damage. Tin creates white opacity when it's available, which it rarely is, and costs more than most potters earn in a year. Most glazes contain combinations of these materials mixed in proportions determined by tradition, superstition, and wishful thinking. The glaze mixing process involves grinding raw materials into powder, then mixing them with water to create a suspension that must be applied to pottery surfaces. The grinding releases toxic dust that coats everything in the workshop with a layer of poison that cannot be cleaned or avoided. Workers develop symptoms of heavy metal poisoning gradually, often attributing their declining health to age or other causes rather than recognizing occupational poisoning. Glaze application requires techniques that combine the precision of scientific measurement with tools that couldn't accurately measure anything. The pottery must be perfectly clean before glazing. But cleaning methods involve abrasives that can damage the pottery surface. The glaze must be applied in even coats of exactly the right thickness. But there are no measuring tools to determine thickness and no way to see the glaze layer clearly on pottery surfaces. Dipping pottery into glaze buckets seems simple until you try to achieve even coverage on complex shapes using glazes that have the consistency of liquid mud and the adhesion properties of wet clay. The glaze tends to run off vertical surfaces, pool in horizontal areas, and create thick spots at the bottom where the pottery was held during dipping. Each of these irregularities will create problems during firing that can destroy the finished pottery. Brushing glaze onto pottery surfaces allows more control but introduces new opportunities for failure. Brush marks remain visible after firing unless the glaze is applied with perfect technique. Overlapping brush strokes create thickness variations that cause color changes and surface defects. Brush bristles shed into the wet glaze and create permanent marks in the fired surface. The brushes themselves wear out quickly and must be constantly replaced with handmade tools that are never quite satisfactory. Kiln loading becomes a three-dimensional puzzle where every mistake has expensive consequences. Glazed pottery cannot touch other pottery during firing, or the glazes will fuse together permanently. This requires sophisticated stacking methods using clay supports that must be custom-made for each firing. The supports themselves can cause problems if they stick to the glazed surfaces or if they shift during firing and allow pottery to touch. The most frustrating aspect of glazing is its complete unpredictability with ancient technology. Identical glazes applied to identical pottery using identical techniques can produce completely different results depending on subtle variations in firing conditions. Atmospheric pressure, humidity levels, and wind direction. Success cannot be replicated reliably, and failures cannot be explained or prevented. Glaze chemistry operates according to principles that won't be understood for thousands of years. Ancient potters developed superstitions and rituals around glazing because they observe correlations between certain practices and successful results. But they don't understand the underlying causes. They know that certain combinations of materials work sometimes, but they don't know why or how to make them work consistently. Your first glazing attempts produce results that look like abstract expressionist paintings created by someone who's colorblind and having muscle spasms. The glaze runs off the pottery in streams, pools in uneven layers, and creates color combinations that don't exist in nature and shouldn't exist anywhere. Master Enkidu examines your work and shakes his head with the weariness of someone who's seen this exact failure thousands of times before. The workshop is filled with examples of glazing disasters from previous apprentices. Pottery fused together into abstract sculptures, glazes that bubbled and crawled off the pottery surface, colors that turned muddy brown regardless of the original glaze color. These failures represent months of work destroyed in single firings. Economic losses that can bankrupt pottery operations. And psychological trauma for potters who've invested everything in techniques they don't understand. Tonight you'll sleep surrounded by pottery waiting for decoration. Pottery that's been decorated and is waiting for glazing. And pottery that's been glazed and is waiting for firing. Each piece represents hours or days of work that can be destroyed at any moment by mistakes, accidents, or simply the inherent unpredictability of ancient ceramic processes. Tomorrow, you'll learn about firing, the final process that determines whether months of work will result in functional pottery or expensive failures. But tonight, you'll dream about toxic glazes, failed decorations, and the growing certainty that pottery making might be the most stressful profession ever invented by humans, who clearly had too much time on their hands and not enough sense to find safer hobbies. Your fourth day in the pottery workshop begins with a harsh economic reality that makes all the previous physical challenges seem like warm-up exercises. Master Enkidu sits you down next to a pile of broken pottery that represents several weeks of failed work and delivers the lesson that separates hobbyists from professionals. Pottery is not art. Pottery is business. Beautiful pottery that doesn't sell is expensive trash. The economics of ancient pottery making operate according to principles that would make modern business consultants weep. You're competing against every other pottery workshop in the region, plus imported pottery from distant locations, plus people who make their own pottery at home, plus alternative materials like wood, leather, and metal containers. Your customers want pottery that's cheap, functional, and available immediately. They don't care about your artistic vision, your technical innovations, or how much effort you put into your work. Enkidu shows you the workshop's account ledger, a series of marks scratched into clay tablets that record the harsh mathematics of pottery production. Each pot requires materials, will, tools, and labor. The materials cost money. The fuel costs money. The tools wear out and need replacement. The labor is your life, measured in hours that cannot be recovered or redirected to more profitable activities. Meanwhile, customers negotiate aggressively for lower prices. Competitors undercut your rates, and market demand fluctuates unpredictably. The pottery market operates on seasonal cycles that create feast or famine conditions for pottery workshops. Spring brings demand for planting pots and water storage vessels as farmers prepare for growing season. Summer creates demand for food storage containers as harvests begin. Fall brings orders for fermentation vessels and preservation containers. Winter kills demand almost completely as people focus on survival rather than purchasing non-essential items. This seasonal demand pattern means that pottery workshops must produce enough income during busy seasons to survive the slow period. But production schedules don't align with demand cycles because pottery making requires months of lead time between starting work and having finished products ready for sale. You must predict market demand months in advance while working with incomplete information about weather patterns, agricultural conditions, and economic factors that affect customer purchasing power. The workshop's production schedule reveals the relentless pressure that drives pottery making. Orders must be filled on time regardless of technical difficulties, material problems, or firing disasters. Customers don't care that your kiln collapsed, your glaze didn't work, or your clay developed problems during shaping. They want their pottery when they ordered it, at the price they agreed to pay, with the functionality they expect. Failure to meet these requirements means losing customers to competitors who can deliver consistent results. Competition between pottery workshops creates a race to the bottom in terms of pricing and working conditions. Workshops that can produce pottery cheaper and faster capture market share from those that focus on quality or innovation. This creates pressure to reduce material costs, speed up production processes, and eliminate any activities that don't directly contribute to immediate profitability. Artistic development, technical experimentation, and quality improvement become luxuries that few workshops can afford. The guild system, which theoretically provides mutual support and quality standards for pottery makers, actually functions as a cartel that restricts competition while extracting fees from workshop operators. Guild membership requires substantial entry payments, annual dues, and compliance with regulations designed more to protect established potters than to serve customers or improve pottery quality. The guild controls who can learn pottery making, where workshops can operate, and what techniques are acceptable for different types of pottery. Guild politics creates additional stress for workshop operators who must navigate complex social relationships while focusing on production demands. Guild masters control access to clay sources, firing facilities, and sales opportunities. Offending the wrong guild official can result in restrictions that make profitable operation impossible. Workshop operators spend considerable time and energy maintaining guild relationships that contribute nothing to pottery production but are essential for business survival. Your health begins deteriorating in ways that weren't immediately apparent during your first few days. Constant exposure to clay dust creates respiratory problems that start as mild coughing but progress to breathing difficulties that interfere with sleep and physical exertion. Your hands develop chronic pain from repetitive motions and chemical exposure. Your back develops permanent problems from the bent-over postures required for wheelwork and pottery decoration. These health problems aren't just personal inconveniences, they're business threats that could end your pottery career at any time. Respiratory disease makes it impossible to work in dusty workshop conditions. Hand injuries prevent the precise motor control required for pottery shaping. Back problems eliminate the physical stamina necessary for long working hours. Ancient pottery makers have no disability insurance. Workers' compensation, or alternative career options if occupational health problems force them out of the trade. The workshop operates with constant awareness that any major accident or illness could destroy the business immediately. A kiln explosion could kill workers and destroy equipment. A clay contamination problem could ruin months of production. A fire could eliminate the entire workshop along with works in progress, finished inventory, and irreplaceable tools. These disasters happen regularly throughout the pottery-making regions, creating a survivor's anxiety among workshop operators who know their turn could come at any time. Master Enkidu tells you about pottery workshops that failed because of single catastrophic events, a kiln collapse that killed the master potter and destroyed the workshop's clay preparation area, a clay contamination problem that made it impossible to produce functional pottery for an entire season, a fire that started when pottery dust ignited and spread to destroy not just the workshop but several neighboring buildings. Each story ends with skilled potters becoming unemployed laborers because their specialized knowledge became worthless when their workshops disappeared. The apprentice system, which promises to provide training in exchange for unpaid labor, actually functions as an exploitative employment arrangement that benefits master potters at the expense of young people who have few alternative options. Apprentices provide years of free labor while learning skills that might never translate into independent employment. Many apprentices never advance beyond assistant level, spending their careers performing routine tasks, while master potters retain control of profitable activities and customer relationships. Even successful apprentices face limited opportunities for advancement. Establishing an independent pottery workshop requires substantial capital investment in equipment, facilities, and materials. Most apprentices lack the financial resources to start their own operations and cannot obtain credit because they own no collateral beyond their pottery skills. This creates a permanent class of skilled workers who remain dependent on master potters throughout their careers. The workshop's tool inventory reveals another economic pressure that affects pottery production quality. Tools wear out constantly and must be replaced regularly. But good tools are expensive and time-consuming to create. Worn-out tools produce inferior work that reduces pottery quality and market value. However, spending time making tools reduces time available for producing saleable pottery. This creates a constant tension between maintaining production quality and meeting production schedules. Clay preparation remains a bottleneck that affects every aspect of workshop operations. Good clay sources become depleted over time and must be replaced with clay from locations that might have different working properties. Transportation costs for heavy clay materials reduce profitability margins. Clay preparation requires enormous amounts of labor that doesn't produce immediate income. Poor clay preparation creates problems that don't become apparent until pottery fails during later production stages. The firing process represents the highest risk activity in pottery production. Months of work can be destroyed in single firings that go wrong due to temperature control problems, atmospheric conditions, or simple bad luck. Kiln operation requires experience and judgment that cannot be easily transferred to new workers. Master potters who understand firing techniques become indispensable to workshop operations, creating dependency relationships that affect business decisions and succession planning. Your education in pottery economics concludes with a sobering assessment of career prospects. Most pottery makers work until they're physically unable to continue, then depend on family members for support because they have no retirement savings or pension plans. Successful pottery workshops rarely generate wealth beyond basic subsistence levels. Innovation and experimentation are discouraged because customers want familiar products and cannot afford to pay premium prices for artistic achievement. The pottery trade operates according to economic principles that reward efficiency and conformity while punishing creativity and quality improvement. Potters who focus on artistic development starve because their work doesn't sell. Potters who pursue technical innovation waste time and materials, developing improvements that customers won't pay extra to obtain. Potters who maintain high-quality standards cannot compete on price with workshops that reduce costs by cutting corners. As evening approaches, you calculate your economic position after 4 days in the pottery trade. You've learned skills that took thousands of years to develop and require years to master. You've gained expertise in materials science, engineering, chemistry, and artistic techniques that represent humanity's accumulated knowledge about ceramic production. You've developed physical capabilities and technical understanding that few people in history have possessed. And you're still earning subsistence wages while destroying your health in working conditions that threaten your life daily. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities for expensive failures, and new reminders that pottery making is not a path to prosperity or security. It's a survival strategy for people who lack better alternatives. Practiced by individuals who've committed their lives to one of humanity's most demanding crafts. Tonight, you'll sleep surrounded by pottery that represents months of work and weeks of worry, knowing that tomorrow's firing could transform it into valuable products or expensive disasters. The difference between success and failure depends on variables you cannot control, techniques you don't fully understand, and market forces that operate according to principles that no ancient potter comprehends. Welcome to the pottery business, where artistic achievement and technical mastery are secondary to the fundamental challenge of staying alive while producing objects that other people need but don't want to pay much for. Chapter 5. When pottery dreams shatter. Your 5th day in the pottery workshop doesn't begin with the usual sounds of wheels spinning and clay being prepared. Instead, it begins with silence, broken only by the sound of Master Enkidu sitting through the rubble of what was once a month's worth of finished pottery. The kiln firing that took place overnight has gone catastrophically wrong. And you're about to witness what happens when an entire pottery operation collapses in a single evening. The kiln explosion occurred around midnight. When the temperature reached the critical point where glazes begin to melt and fuse with clay bodies, something went wrong with the fuel supply, the temperature control, or simply the accumulated stress of firing pottery that was already compromised by months of marginal clay preparation. The result is a scene that looks like a ceramic bomb went off, scattering fragments of destroyed pottery across the workshop and ending several families' economic hopes in one devastating moment. Enkidu picks up pieces of what was once a large storage jar that represented weeks of work and months of drying time. The jar exploded during firing, destroying not only itself but several other pieces that were positioned nearby. The shock waves from the explosion cracked the kiln walls, making future firings impossible until major repairs can be completed. The workshop has just lost its primary source of income and its means of production simultaneously. This is how pottery dreams end, Enkidu says, holding up a handful of ceramic shards that represent someone's life savings. Not with artistic triumph or technical breakthrough. With mathematics, the mathematics of expenses that exceed income, of production costs that exceed market prices, of physical demands that exceed human endurance. You survey the damage and begin to understand the economic death spiral that destroys pottery workshops throughout the ancient world. The failed firing represents months of investment in materials, labor, and fuel that produced no saleable products. The kiln damage requires repairs that will consume whatever financial reserves the workshop maintained for emergencies. The lost production time means missing seasonal sales opportunities that won't return for another year. But the kiln disaster is just the most dramatic example of a pottery trade that's been failing gradually for years due to forces that individual workshops cannot control. The market for pottery has become saturated as more workshops compete for the same customers. Import competition brings cheaper pottery from regions with lower labor costs and better clay sources. Alternative materials like metal containers and leather vessels capture market share from traditional pottery products. The workshop's customer base has been shrinking as economic conditions deteriorate throughout the region. Agricultural problems reduce farmers' income, limiting their ability to purchase new pottery. Political instability disrupts trade routes that connected pottery makers with distant markets. Population decline in urban areas reduces demand for the specialized pottery that generated higher profit margins. Master Enkidu explains the broader economic trends that are killing the pottery trade throughout the known world. Bronze working technology has advanced to the point where metal containers offer advantages that pottery cannot match. Bronze vessels are lighter, stronger, and don't break when dropped. They can be repaired when damaged and recycled when worn out. Most importantly, bronze containers have become status symbols that pottery cannot compete with among customers who have disposable income. Ironworking, still in its early stages, promises to create even more competition for pottery makers. Iron tools are already displacing pottery tools for many applications. Iron containers, when the technology develops sufficiently, will offer all the advantages of bronze at lower costs. The pottery trade faces technological disruption that will eliminate many of its traditional market segments permanently. Environmental problems compound the economic pressures facing pottery workshops. Deforestation around major pottery production centers has eliminated local fuel sources, forcing workshops to import expensive wood from increasingly distant locations. Clay sources have become depleted or contaminated as intensive mining destroys the geological formations that created high-quality pottery clay over thousands of years. The workshop's clay storage pits reveal another dimension of the pottery industry's decline. The clay that's available now is noticeably different from clay that was available when Enkidu began his apprenticeship decades ago. It's less plastic, more prone to cracking, and requires more extensive preparation to achieve acceptable working properties. The best clay sources have been exhausted, leaving pottery makers to work with increasingly marginal materials that produce inferior results. Water pollution from upstream pottery workshops has contaminated the river water that local potters depend on for clay preparation and pottery production. The runoff from clay processing, combined with chemical residues from glaze preparation, has created water quality problems that affect entire watersheds. Pottery making has begun destroying the environmental resources that the industry depends on for survival. Climate changes that seem minor to casual observers have major impacts on pottery production. Slightly different rainfall patterns affect clay properties and drying conditions. Temperature variations change kiln performance and fuel consumption rates. Wind pattern changes affect firing conditions and workshop ventilation. Pottery making depends on environmental stability that no longer exists in many regions. The workshop's failed apprentice program illustrates another factor contributing to the pottery trade's decline. Young people who once would have committed to pottery apprenticeships are choosing other occupations that offer better working conditions and more reliable income. The physical demands of pottery making, combined with occupational health hazards and limited economic prospects, make pottery careers unattractive to anyone with alternative options. Experienced potters are leaving the trade as fast as they can find other employment. The accumulated knowledge and skills that took generations to develop are disappearing as master potters die without passing their expertise to new practitioners. Technical innovations are being lost because no one has economic incentive to preserve or develop pottery-making knowledge. Cultural changes also threaten the pottery trade as societies develop different aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. Pottery styles that were popular for centuries suddenly become outdated, as cultural influences from distant regions introduce new design concepts. Customers want pottery that looks different from traditional local styles. But pottery makers cannot easily adapt their techniques to produce unfamiliar forms. Religious and social changes affect pottery demand in ways that individual workshops cannot predict or control. Ceremonial pottery requirements change when religious practices evolve. Social customs that once required specific pottery forms disappear as communities adopt new traditions. Political changes eliminate aristocratic customers who provided the high-margin specialty pottery orders that kept many workshops profitable. The guild system that once provided stability for pottery makers has become a burden that accelerates industry decline. Guild regulations prevent workshops from adapting to changing market conditions by requiring adherence to traditional production methods and product specifications. Guild fees extract capital that workshops need for investment in equipment improvements or materials upgrades. Guild politics create conflicts that waste energy and resources on disputes unrelated to pottery production. Migration and demographic changes empty entire regions of the customers who supported local pottery industries. Young people move to urban areas where economic opportunities seem better, leaving behind aging populations with declining purchasing power. Warfare displaces populations and destroys the social networks that connected pottery makers with their traditional customer bases. You witness the human cost of pottery industry decline as skilled craftsmen who spent decades mastering their trade find themselves unemployable because their specialized knowledge has become economically worthless. Master potters who once commanded respect and decent wages now compete for manual labor jobs that pay subsistence wages. Workshop owners who invested their lives in pottery production face economic ruin as their businesses become unsustainable. The psychological impact of watching an entire industry disappear affects pottery makers in ways that go beyond simple economic hardship. Their cultural identity was built around craft traditions that connected them to ancestors who practiced the same skills for thousands of years. The disappearance of pottery making represents the loss of cultural continuity that gave meaning to their work and their lives. Enkidu's final lesson takes place among the ruins of the destroyed pottery, where months of work have been reduced to ceramic fragments that have no economic value and cannot be repaired or recycled. Pottery taught us patience, he says, because clay demands time for every process. But pottery also taught us acceptance, because clay breaks. Everything breaks eventually. The workshop closes permanently the following week. The kiln repairs would cost more than the workshop could generate in revenue during its remaining profitable years. The clay sources have become too expensive and unreliable. The market demand has shifted to products that cannot be produced with traditional pottery making techniques. Master Enkidu becomes a manual laborer in construction projects that build with stone and brick rather than pottery. As you leave the pottery workshop for the final time, you understand that you've witnessed not just the failure of a single business, but the end of an era in human civilization. Pottery making represented humanity's first major industrial technology, the foundation for settled agriculture, urban development, and complex societies. Its decline marks a transition to new technologies that will reshape human relationships with materials, production, and craftsmanship. The pottery-making skills that took thousands of years to develop will survive in some regions and some communities. But they'll never again be essential technologies that determine the success or failure of entire civilizations. Pottery will become a specialized craft, a decorative art, a hobby activity for people who can afford to practice traditional techniques for personal satisfaction rather than economic necessity. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where the pottery trade has collapsed, leaving behind abandoned workshops, unused tools, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of craftsmen who devoted their lives to mastering one of humanity's most fundamental technologies. Tomorrow will bring different work, different challenges, and different relationships between human creativity and material production. The age of pottery has ended, not with artistic triumph or technical achievement, but with the quiet recognition that human societies have developed beyond the need for ancient crafts that once seemed essential for survival. Progress. you realize often looks like decline when viewed from the perspective of people whose lives were built around technologies that the world no longer needs. Sweet dreams of electric pottery wheels, temperature-controlled kilns, and hobby pottery classes, where the biggest risk is getting clay on your clothes. Your ancestors' pottery nightmares ended so that your pottery dreams could be relaxing, creative, and completely optional.